Hi, my name is Pastor John Hall, and I like to throw out to the evangelical faith community those who are interested in eschatology and the 70th week of Daniel and how long the tribulation actually lasts. I'd like to throw out this simple question, which is: does the Bible teach that the tribulation lasts 7 years, or does it in fact teach that it lasts only 3.5 years? So I like to look into this subject. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Pastor John Hall. I do have a master's in divinity. I've been in ministry for many years, but most importantly, I wrote a book on Bible chronology, a timeline from Genesis all the way to the end. And I do know why and how everybody charts every date that they chart. So whether I'm right or wrong, or whoever's right and wrong, the point of it is I'm aware of how people come to the dates that they come to. I also wrote a book on a syllabus on the book of Revelation. Many people have done this and did a timeline chart of the events in the book of Revelation. So I am familiar with all the questions involved here. So we're going to look then at all the verses here very quickly. We're going to go through them. There's 9 of them found in Daniel and Revelation, and then we're going to read through them, each one individually, very quickly. Then we're going to look at the implications of this. Where does this mean that where do we place the rapture? And then also, how did we come to believe it's 7 years if in fact it's only 3.5 years? So let's look at the verses. Daniel chapter 7, it's 3.5 years. Chapter 9, verse 27, you have the 70th week of Daniel, but it's in the middle when the treaty is broken and the Antichrist starts to do his destruction, 3.5 years. In 12, 6, and 7, it asks the question specifically, how long does it last? It's 3.5 years. In verse 11 of the same chapter, it's 1,290 days to get everything set up. You're blessed if you reach to the 1335th day. In Revelation 11:2, we have the Gentiles trampling Jerusalem for 1,260 days, the 2 witnesses for 1,260 days, the Jews who escape into the wilderness for 1,260 days, and then, of course, the Antichrist and the false prophet who rule and reign destruction on the earth for 42 months. So, as we look at these passages, I would like to point out the simple observation that the only time frame that is suggested is 3.5 years. Let's look at the verses specifically. Daniel chapter 7, verse 25 says, "He, the Antichrist, will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for times, and half a time." So that's 3.5 years. Daniel 9:27, most people can quote. If you're into eschatology, you can quote this verse. "He, the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant," that's a treaty with the many nations in the world, for 1/7, for a 7-year period of time, 70th week of Daniel. In the middle of the 7, he, the Antichrist, will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Of course, Jesus refers to this. And so in the middle half of 7 is 3.5 years. Daniel chapter 12, verses 5 and 6 asks this question specifically. "Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two other angels. One of them said, 'How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? How long does the tribulation last?' And the other angel swore by him who lives forever, saying, 'It will be for times, and half a time.' When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed." Then in verse 11 and 12, we have from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that caused desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Now, most of us would chart that last 30 days is when the Antichrist, Satan, and the false prophet go out to the world and gather all the nations to fight Jesus at the battle of Armageddon. So in verse 12, then, blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. In other words, if you can make it for the next 45 days, you survive, you're still alive, then Jesus is reigning on earth, and there's finally peace, and there's finally some sanity in life, no more war, and we're into the millennial reign. So those are the Daniel passages. Now the Revelation ones are very straightforward. First of all, Gentiles trampling Jerusalem, but exclude the outer court, do not measure it because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. Now, verse 3 is very important because it says, and I, God, obviously, will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now, we all know that's Elijah. Many believe the second one is Enoch, maybe Moses. But the point of it is the 2 witnesses are put into the boxing ring at the same time that the Gentiles are trampling the holy city for 42 months as God's team to speak into this time frame. So if we're going to chart the trampling of Jerusalem, or the second half of the 70th week of Daniel, then we need to put the 2 witnesses at the second half of the 70th week of Daniel. Then, of course, we have the well-known event in which some remnant of the Jews escape in the desert and are protected by God there. And it says the women Israel, that is Israel, fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days, which, of course, we all chart as the second half of the second 70th week of Daniel. And then more information in verse 14 about how that happens. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness. So obviously aviation, and that's very probably would have been unbelievable for John to see that, but we know what that is. But again, the important thing here is where she will be taken care of for times and a half a time out of the servant's reach. So again, 3.5 years. And then finally, the last passage that we have that talks about the duration of the tribulation period is the Antichrist himself. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. Now, of course, this includes the false prophet, and everyone's going to chart. This is occurring in the second half of the 70th week of Daniel. It begins when the Antichrist is revealed when he desecrates the temple. So again, let's look at all the passages. We read through them. We've seen them. They all are referring to 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 1,290 days, 42 months. There is no passage in the Bible that suggests that the tribulation lasts 7 years. Now, the 70th week of Daniel is 7 years. The treaty is 7 years. But the actual time of tribulation is all in the second half of the 70th week of Daniel and lasts 3.5 years. So, how then would we chart the 70th week of Daniel? Well, we put the 7-year treaty in there. We put peace and safety at the beginning. But then we would place all the tribulation events, the seals judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments. We would all put them all in the second half of the 70th week of Daniel. Then, therefore, where would we chart the rapture? Where is a pre-tribulation rapture? Well, we'd have to place it here. And so it would be placed before the tribulation period, but in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. This is not a mid-tribulation charting. Mid-tribulation would say that the tribulation lasts 7 years, and we're going to do it in the middle of the tribulation. This is not what is being stated here. If you're going to do a mid-trib, it would be there. No one does this. No one puts the rapture is happening in the middle of the second half of the 70th week. We just don't do that. Okay, but most are going to chart it here. And if you're going to chart it here, then I would suggest that it would be better to describe it as a pre-70th week of Daniel rapture. It's definitely before the tribulation period, the time of tribulation, but it's more specifically before the 70th week of Daniel begins. Now, this is not what the scripture is suggesting. It's 3.5 years, not 7 years long. So the question then becomes, how do we come to say 7-year tribulation period? I grew up with this from a young child. I mean, the chart was up there. It's always been 7 years. How do we come up with this? Well, I'd like to first just refer to Wikipedia just to establish the fact that this is what we believe. I don't think we're going to say anything that nobody knows, but just to, again, confirm the fact that this is what we believe. So the rapture, according to Wikipedia, which we wrote, somebody from the faith community wrote this, and accurately said, pre-tribulationism was popularized in the 1830s by John Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren and promoted in the Schofield Bible in the early 20th century. And then it defines it as, or describes it as, pre-tribulationists chart Jesus' return for the church, that is the rapture, before a 7-year tribulation period and the second coming with the church at Armageddon. So this is just reflecting what the common belief is among our evangelical people who chart the and do a timeline on the 70th week of Daniel. Now, notice the educator and preachers who teach this. So this this isn't a criticism; it's just acknowledgement of all the number of people, famous people who teach this or have taught this. Jimmy Swaggart, Robert Jeffries, J. Dwight Pentecost, Tim LaHaye, J. Vern McGee and his Bible Bus, Perry Stone, Chuck Smith, Hal Lindsey, Jack Van Impe, Chuck Missler, Grant Jeffrey, Thomas Ice, David Jeremiah, John MacArthur, and John Hagee, just to name a few of the most famous people who have great followings. Also, we have this historical bit of information, which many of us might have lived through. It was popularized in the 1970s by Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which many people came to Christ during that time and sold millions of copies. The movie A Thief in the Night, many of us saw that. And in 1995, of course, we have Tim LaHaye's most famous series, the Left Behind books, the Left Behind series, and over 80 million copies were sold. So this is just confirming the fact that the common belief is 7-year tribulation period, but the Bible is only suggesting 3.5 years. So the question would be then, how did we get there? How did we end up charting 7 years if in fact it's only 3.5 years? I would like to throw out two options. Two ways that it probably came about. Now, I believe it occurred many, many, many years ago. Schofield Bible Notes, they started out with 7 years, even though it was 9 verses, only 3.5 years, but it got started and it has basically not been questioned. So how do we get there though? Well, first of all, I would suggest the two prophets. So if we're going to chart the two prophets during the first 3.5 years, now many people do this, then we can say that their plagues are part of the tribulation, so it must last 7 years. That would be reasonable. If the two prophets are prophesying the first 3.5 years of the 70th week of Daniel, then it would be true that they have God's wrath and they're pouring out plagues, and therefore there would be tribulation. But this is quite impossible to chart it there because Jesus basically says, what are we looking for? We're looking for the Antichrist desecrating the temple. We're not looking for Elijah to show up. So in verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus replied, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. So quite frankly, then, what is Jesus saying we should look for as the next major event that we'd all recognize? And that would be the Antichrist obviously desecrating the temple. Now, if the rapture occurs before the tribulation, we're not here, but other people who are here could recognize that that's what the Bible was saying. However, if the two prophets are at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, Jesus would have said, look for my two witnesses who will be preaching and prophesying in the holy city, and then you will know that the tribulation is about to happen. He did not say that because the two prophets aren't in the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. They must be placed in the second half. Now, a second way, I think that once the idea that it lasts for 7 years got so established in the minds and hearts of people, I believe this is another way or a common way that it happens that people chart 7 years. So, option number 2 would be this: the seal judgments are misplaced and put in as starting at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. I believe that it has to be the seal judgment, trumpet judgment, and bowl judgments all have to be in the second half. And notice the first seal. The first seal is the Antichrist going out. Well, how can he go out if, in fact, he hasn't desecrated the temple yet? So it's basically saying the Antichrist goes out when he's desecrated the temple. Therefore, they start at the second half of the 70th week of Daniel. The war breaks out. Seal 2, Seal 3 is worldwide famine. Seal 4 is 1/4 of mankind dies. So all of these need to be in the second half of the 70th week. But if I'm reading through Revelation, I have in my mind that it's 7 years long, and I come to chapter 6, verse 1, and I start to read about this tribulation, then what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to, based on this assumption that it's 7 years already firmly in my mind, I'm going to start the seal judgments at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. And therefore, I would say, well, the 70th week of Daniel and the tribulation, and well, it lasts 7 years. And so now I see the seal judgments. I'm going to place them at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Therefore, now it's 7 years. And it's kind of like circling around, starting with the assumption that 7 years and therefore charting it that way. Now, I think this is what's happened over and over and over and over again, because the basic core question of how long has it last, or how long does the tribulation last, was never actually questioned. Now, the question that I have that is very troubling to me, I don't have an answer. I think it is something that needs to be discussed and needs to be reconciled. And the question is, why did God allow us to believe for nearly 200 years that the tribulation lasts 7 years when in fact it only lasts 3.5 years? I mean, look at this. We have all these great men and scholars, people who have been at this for decades and decades, reading these verses, studying this, putting out timelines, discussing among their friends, putting out conferences, having eschatology conferences, having sermon after sermon after sermon, always saying 7-year tribulation. And yet these are mighty men of God, people in Scripture. And yet, how is it possible, if it is in fact 3.5 years, which I think the Bible is saying it is, how did we get it wrong? How did we get it wrong? I don't really know how that happened in the sense of why did God allow it to happen? Even if it got started back in the Schofield Bible days, why did the Lord allow it to continue when in fact all the verses are saying differently? Well, I would like to suggest that that this is the answer, or this is the duration, 3.5 years. I believe I can speak into this meaningfully. So if you would like me to be a part of a program that you have, whether it's a YouTube or some other channel, I don't know if this video is going to go anywhere. Maybe 5 people listen to it, maybe 500. I have no idea. But if in fact you're watching this and you'd like to get a hold of me, you can text me at 419-282-6186. I'll get back in touch with you. I can find out your name, who you are, verify your information, and then we can have a conversation about maybe being a part of your program. I have no idea whether that would happen, but at least I'm throwing it out there. I appreciate you listening to this. I hope it was helpful. I hopeful it's a challenge to our belief about how to chart the 70th week of Daniel, and the fact that we do need to make it 3.5 years, not 7 years. Thanks for watching. God bless.